as well. And this week we're going to kind of pick up from where Ed left off last week. And if you remember, Naaman was one of the military leaders for the king there in Syria, and he came to get to be cleansed of his leprosy. And Ed went through last week and explained how that happened. That whole story. We're not going to go through it completely, but as we see in chapters 5 and 6, leading up to our study today in chapter 7. A few things happened there, and as we see the prophets that Elisha was with. They travel down. They've decided, look, it's time for us to go and build homes, and so they go down to out to a different area near the Jordan, and Elisha agrees to go with them. And we see the story of there, the floating axe head, and we're not going to go through some of these things in detail, but these are some more miracles that Elisha was a part of. If you remember back when Elisha followed Elijah, Elisha asked for a double portion of God's Spirit. And I was reading this week of one fellow talking about there's not an exact way to define what this double portion of God's Spirit is, but we can see several evidences of it because Elisha did have a longer ministry than Elijah did. And if we go through and count up the miracles that are named and listed, we begin to see how that actually worked out in number, because Elijah is part of about 14 or so miracles, and Elisha we can find 28. And so that double portion of God's Spirit begins to show up. Here's one of those miracles, the floating axe head, as the axe head was borrowed and it's lost in the water. And Elisha comes and says, it's going to float. And they get ready, he throws a stick in and it floats. And there's a miracle there. And we see the Aramean War in the middle part of chapter 6. And we won't go through that completely, of course, but these are the things that lead up to our story for today, because during this time period, we think back to Solomon and his desire for counting up all his gold and chasing women, and he took his eye off of the surrounding areas, and before you know it, all those other little villages began to get larger, and now all of a sudden Syria is a country again. And Damascus is a country again, and they've started becoming stronger and stronger. And now these things have years later come to be a problem, because Syria has become just enough of a power that it's starting to be a harassment to the people in Israel. Northern Kingdom of Israel, Southern Kingdom of Judah, we remember the split. And so not in the capital cities of anything, but in these surrounding villages, these little nations like Syria started to be a harassment. They started attacking these small villages, and it just became a way of life for these people to constantly have one eye over your shoulder looking to make sure that nobody was ready to attack that day. But just so happened that as we go through this, we get to the siege of Samaria, and that's where we're going to pick up in today's text, chapter 6, and we're going to go to verse 24. That's not in our study book for today, but we're going to read straight out of Scripture. And it says, sometime later, King Ben-Hadad, and that's of Aram, or Syria, brought all his military units together, and he marched up and laid siege to Samaria. Now, Samaria was the capital of Israel at the time, this northern kingdom of Israel. So there was a severe famine in Samaria, and they continued to siege against it until a donkey's head sold for 34 ounces of silver, and a cup of dove's dung sold for 2 ounces of silver. Yuck. That's all we'll say. So what happened was, Ben-Hadad has decided he's going to attack with full onslaught this city of Samaria. And I tried to think of something that we could compare it to, and the most recent thing I can think of is what we've seen in the news a lot of, how Russia has begun to attack cities in Ukraine, and you've probably watched that over the last several months. But a lot of instances, they're going into a city, and they're surrounding the city, and basically saying to the citizens, you're either going to surrender or we're going to starve you out. And they've choked off all the supplies, they've choked off all the provisions, and they've said, there's no way you're going to escape. You're just either going to surrender and we're going to take you into captivity, or you're going to starve. And that's what happened here as King Ben-Hadad sends these people into Samaria and all his military he can, and it says he laid siege to Samaria. So he surrounded the city, and the king of Israel was there and everything. Now, leading up to this, we see as Elisha has warns this king over and over of where Ben-Hadad's going. And Ben-Hadad has had it. And he says, I'm tired of this guy, Elisha. But here we see as they laid siege to the city, all of a sudden the supplies became more and more scarce, and the food became more and more scarce. And it says there that a donkey's head sold for 34 ounces of silver, a cup of dove's dung. There was starvation beginning to be a problem, and famine starting to take over what was happening in that area. So if we go on down in verse 26, it said, as the king of Israel was passing by on the wall, a woman cried out to him, my lord, the king, help. So we start to see here how bad it's really getting. Even the king is walking around and the citizens are begging out to him for some kind of help. He answers in verse 27, if the Lord doesn't help you, where can I get help for you? From the threshing floor or the wine press? Well, both of those are empty, by the way. Then the king asked her, what's the matter? Okay, so we're starting now to begin to see how desperate things are getting. And this next portion is kind of hard to read and kind of hard for us to discuss and think about. But we start to see cannibalism become prevalent, and this shows us just how severe this famine is getting. Next verse says, she said, this woman said to me, give up your son, and we will eat him today, and then we'll eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son and ate him. And I said to her the next day, give up your son, and we will eat him. But she has hidden her son. So we see a story here of two women, and they've decided that they're desperate enough, it's time for them to actually eat their kids. And the first lady did so, and the second one has decided she's not willing to do this. But the king has heard these words. In verse 30 it says he heard the woman's words, and he tore his clothes. Now that's what they would do. If you remember Old Testament history, anytime something bad would happen, shamefulness, disgust, dismay, despair, all these kinds of feelings, they would literally take their outside garment and just rip it. And it was a sign of their anguish and how bad it was, and how bad they felt, and how desperate they were. So it said that he tore his clothes. Then as he was passing by on the wall, the people saw that there was sackcloth under his clothes next to his skin. This caught my attention because we would not expect the king to be wearing sackcloth. But that's what they would wear during this time of mourning and depression. You remember, you would hear them, they said, would sit among the ashes and things like this. And they know, we see here that the writer of 2 Kings, we believe Jeremiah, says that the king was wearing sackcloth and the people noticed it. Under his clothes next to his skin, in verse 31, he announced, may God punish me and do so severely if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today. Now, as it was always go in these days, whenever something good would happen, the prophet would get the praise, but whenever something bad would happen, the prophet would get all the blame. And the king here has decided this is all Elisha's doing. Elisha talks to God. He's a man of God. He knows what's going on. And I'm tired of Elisha bringing problems to us. Anything that became a problem, he would blame it on Elisha. Elijah got the same treatment. And so he's decided, today's the day, we're going to take care of Elisha. I'm tired of this. So verse 32, Elisha was sitting in his house, and the elders were sitting with him. Then the king sent a man ahead of him, but before the messenger got to him, Elisha said to the elders, do you see how this murderer has sent someone to remove my head? Look, when the messenger comes, shut the door to keep him out. Isn't the sound of his master's feet behind him? So Elisha is sitting in his house, and he already knows what's going on. If we go back in the chapter 6 a little farther, we begin to see how King Ben-Hadad was so tired of the fact that Elisha knew where he was about to attack next. You see, God was with Elisha, and he was telling Elisha every step of the way what was about to happen and how to protect the people. We're going to get a little further into a thought in a few minutes, but want to point out here at this time, because we have to remember, just because the nation split, and just because the kingdom of Judah was the tribe of Judah and little Benjamin, those other 10 tribes that split off and went with Jeroboam back in the history when after Solomon's death, and they went and worshipped Baal's gods, and they started going against God and leaving his worship. Those were still God's chosen people. Those 10 tribes, God never said, okay, you're out. Because if we go back in history to when Jacob was told, your family will be the 12 tribes. You will be the chosen nation of Israel, and his name was changed. And so we see that progression from then on, that God never turns his back on his people. So here in verse 32, while Elisha's sitting in his house, and we just read that as this messenger is going to be sent to go find Elisha. And the king has had it. In verse 33, it says, while Elisha was still speaking with them, the messenger came down to him. Then he said, this disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer? Okay, and now we're going to get to what's in our book in chapter 7, as we begin to talk about our text for today. Chapter 7, verse 1. Elisha replies, hear the word of the Lord, and this is what the Lord says. I want to stop here for a second, because that caught my eye. Did you catch that he said 2 times? Hear the word of the Lord, this is what the Lord says. Not just hear the word of the Lord one time. It was, I want you to understand, this word that I'm about to tell you is from God. It's not from me. You listen to what the Lord says. This is straight from him. And he says, about this time, tomorrow at Samaria's gate, 6 quarts of fine flour will sell for half an ounce of silver, and 12 quarts of barley will sell for half an ounce of silver. Now, when we go back over, earlier we talked about 34 ounces of silver and 2 ounces of silver for nasty stuff, right? Now we're talking about good things, flour and barley. These are things that they could actually use, healthy things that they could cook with. This is the things that would feed the people. And we are going from a high price for something terrible to a very, very cheap price for something useful. Now, we've all experienced some of this thing in our country now that some people don't want to admit that is here. It's called inflation, okay? And things cost more than they used to, right? Okay, went to the grocery store. If you've been in the last 2 weeks anytime, you went and you probably figured out, ladies especially, because you probably do more shopping than the guys do, but you say, wait a minute, this costed more than it used to. And gas, and everybody goes to buy gas. Wait a minute, this gas is way more than it used to be. Well, you didn't have to be a genius to figure this out. These folks knew things costed a lot, and to find anything was impossible to eat. And so here Elisha is making a promise, by tomorrow, in 24 hours, you're going to be able to find all this stuff. It's going to be useful, and it's going to be cheap. There's going to be so much of it, and the price is going to drop. So you can imagine what the people who are listening to him are probably thinking. This guy's crazy. Now, we can blame them, but we'd probably be the same way. But my first thought here was, wait a minute, you guys have seen all this stuff Elisha has done. You've seen all these miracles he's been a part of. By now, you should probably take his word for some of this stuff. But they didn't. And it says here in verse 2, then the captain, the king's right-hand man, responded to the man of God. And he says, look, even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this really happen? Elisha announced, you will in fact see it with your own eyes, but you won't eat any of it. So what do we begin to see here? Doubt. The first thing I thought of was the doubt that this man had. I mean, the first thing he says is, could this really happen? Surely he had heard some of the things that Elisha had been a part of. Surely he had seen some of the things and heard some of the things that Elijah had done. And now he ought to be saying, hey, if this guy says it, it's probably going to come true. I don't know how, but it's probably going to happen. You know, it's dangerous for us to question God's power. It's dangerous for us to try to decide, well, I'm not really sure if God can do this. If we go into James chapter 1 and verse 6, I've hit this verse because it just popped in my mind, the word doubt. And I remember when we studied it loud a year or two ago, this verse came to mind. In verse 6 it says, "But let him ask in faith without doubting. For the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That a person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded and unstable in all his ways." So we see the danger of doubt. Well, it's easy for us in our physical, limited minds to say that's not possible, because we understand things only from our realm, only from our limitations. We say, I can't do that, so maybe God can't do that. And instead we ought to be saying, well, I can't do that, but God can do that. So he makes a promise to this messenger. He says, you'll see it with your own eyes. You're going to see it, but you won't eat any of it. Now, we're not told there exactly in detail why won't he eat any of it. Okay, we're told he's going to see it, but we don't know why he won't get to enjoy it. Got an idea, don't we? But we won't know till later. So doubting God can lead to some missed opportunities. Have you ever been in that position? I know all of us have times when we say, well, I'm not quite sure God can do this on his own. He may need my help. And we begin to doubt. And I believe that doubt comes straight from Satan himself. Satan has the ability to take us from a place of faith and trusting in God and say, he can't quite do it the way you think. And that's what Satan did with Adam and Eve. And it's what he did with all kinds of people throughout the Bible, as we see them have little spots of doubt. And it became a problem. And it can do the same thing to us if we're not careful, as we begin to miss out on the opportunities of seeing what God can do in big and mighty ways. If we just say, you know what, he can do that. I'm not sure how, but he can do that. Now we're going to start to see next, as the story shifts to a whole nother section. So we're in chapter 7 still, of course, and he says, could he really make it happen? He says, promising me you won't eat any of it. So we go to verse 3, and we see these 4 men. It says, now 4 men with a skin disease were at the entrance to the city gate. We're at Samaria still. The city gate is where most of the commerce happened, right? It's where all the trading happened. People came to the city gate, and a lot of trading there. And so the city gate was where all the action was. So they were sitting at the entrance to the city gate, and they said to each other, why just sit here until we die? Now let's wait a minute. Why are these guys here to begin with? If you remember from Old Testament history, when someone contracted leprosy or any other type of disease, they were kind of treated as outcasts from then on. And in fact, the Old Testament law would put them as, you can't be associated with the healthy people anymore. It was a lifetime ban. You have to go live over there. You're no longer allowed to associate with the people that don't have that disease, because you might give it to them. And so leprous people were treated as outcasts, third-class citizens. They had to live in own little colonies by themselves. And these 4 men are in this group. Now, there's no proof to what I'm about to say, but it's just something I heard this week and read also. But just a little side story here. When Naaman, that Ed talked about last week, was healed of his leprosy, Elisha's servant's name was Gehazi. Well, Gehazi was there when Naaman came with all that money. Do you remember the money that Naaman was sent with? I read this week it was valued, today's money would be about $1.2 million worth of gold and silver that he was prepared to give to Elisha for healing him. Elisha would not take the money. Why would he not take the money? Because then it would invalidate the healing that God had done. It would say, hey, I did it, but only for the dough, only for the money. No, Elisha said, I'm going to heal you, but I want you to know that God is the one that healed you, not me, and I'm not doing it for cash. I'm doing it because you need to see God's power. Okay, so Gehazi was Elisha's servant, and once Naaman gets out of sight, Gehazi's sitting there thinking, wait a minute, what? Why did he just turn down $1 million? This was our chance to places nobody can, there's famine everywhere. These things are terrible. And so Gehazi sneaks to Naaman and makes up a story in order to get some of that money. And Gehazi is found out by Elisha later to have lied to him. And he says, where you been? And Gehazi said, I ain't been anywhere. But he in fact had been somewhere, and he in fact had taken some money, and he in fact lied straight to Naaman and to Elisha, and in a sense he lied to God as well. And so Gehazi was given the punishment of leprosy that Naaman had. And he says in that verse that you and your descendants will have this disease from now on. Now, why do I tell you that? Because I read this week that it's possible that these 4 men we're reading about right here could be Gehazi and his sons. Don't know it for sure. It's not listed as his name, but I believe Jeremiah included these 4 men for a reason. And I believe that maybe God chose these 4 men, and it could have been Gehazi and his sons, for a purpose that we're going to read about as we study on the rest of our lesson. So, they're at the city gate, and they start contemplating their circumstances. They say, why should we just sit here until we die? If we say, let's go into the city, we're going to die there because there's famine in the city. So going into the city wasn't going to help them. There was no food in the city. If they did go in the city and they found food, they sure couldn't afford it. And he says, if we stay here, we're also going to die. We're going to starve if we sit here. So option number 2 isn't very well. So he says, now, come on. Let's surrender to the Arameans' camp. Now we're talking about Ben-Hadad, the Arameans, the Syrians. It says, let's go to the Arameans' camp, and if they let us live, then we'll live. If they kill us, we're going to die. So they're looking at their options, and they said, we got 4 options here. We can sit right here and starve. We can go in the city, and we'll be okay for a little while, but then we're probably going to starve there too. If we go into the Arameans' camp, and they can sit outside of the city gate, and they can see the Arameans' camp, and they're looking over there, and they're going, look at those guys. They got food. They got all the provisions they need. They got animals. They got stuff to cook with. They got weapons and artillery. They got everything they need. We're over here starving. And they said, option 3 and 4. We can go to their camp, and maybe they'll let us live. Maybe they'll kill us. But we're no worse off going there than we are staying here. In fact, we've got a better shot of making it if we just try it. Now, it's not in our lesson book, but the first thing that came to my mind as I started looking at and thinking about their options, they're sitting there day after day, starving. No one will give them any credibility or attention. They have no place in society. They're a complete outcast, right? And I started thinking about this is exactly like the mind of a person who is lost and desperate. Think about it. A person who is lost and desperate in a bad situation, they are sitting there contemplating, what is my next move to try to find satisfaction? What's my next option to find peace and happiness? What's my next chance or opportunity at finding a place where I can live in peace and fulfillment? And they start weighing those things, right? And sometimes they make the wrong choice and they say, I'm going over there. I'm going to try it. And they do exactly what these guys did. They say, we can look at in different situations, and they would say, I'm going to go for the city. I'm going to go in the city because I'm going to get temporary happiness for a little while, and then I'm going to starve and die. Or they say, I'm just going to sit right here and wait it out, and they die. Or they say, I'm going to go try this thing or that thing, and all of them are failures. But once that person finally says, if I just, look at the words, let's surrender to the Arameans' camp. And to a lost person, it's, I'm going to surrender my life to God. Because I don't know everything about it, but I know I see good things there. And I got to try. And once that person finally decides, I'm going to surrender myself, surrender my life, surrender my own soul to God, to follow in Christ, Then they start finding what we're about to see. Let's read on. Verse 5. So the diseased men got up at twilight. Remember the time, twilight. To go to the Arameans' camp, and when they came to the camp's edge, they discovered that no one was there. Nobody's there. Why? For the Lord had caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots, horses, and a large army. Wait a minute. The camp was full of people. It was full of soldiers. The military was strong. All of a sudden, they head over there, and then when they get there, nobody's there. We're not even told in detail what happened to cause them to get up. We don't get to see the action, but we get the key words that all that matters. For the Lord had caused. The Lord caused. God did this. Listen, He caused the Aramean camp to hear the sound of chariots, horses, and a large army. They're sitting there in camp, they're playing checkers, whatever, and they're just enjoying themselves. And the next thing you know, God sends these noises of chariots, horses, and a large army, and they freak out. And they decide, the Arameans had said to each other, the king of Israel must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Egypt to attack us. Now, those are the Hittites and the Egyptians. They were different directions, and a lot of times the kings would hire neighboring nations to come and fight for them. And they're thinking, that's what's happened. The king of Israel, he's hired the Hittites, he's hired the Egyptians to come and attack us. And so they fled and had gotten up and fled at twilight. Them 4 men got up at twilight. Now, some people can call that coincidence. I read man this week, he says coincidence, you can call it what you want to. He said, I'll just say coincidence is an act of God where he just decided not to draw a lot of attention to it. But the timing was everything. At the exact time that the 4 men got up to go to the camp, there was an action going on at the camp where God made these noises, and for some reason, it doesn't say that these 4 men heard any of these sounds. You would think they would hear it. It's at twilight. There's not a lot of noise. It says they fled at twilight, abandoning everything, their tents, the horses, and the donkeys. The camp was intact, and they fled for their lives. And when the diseased men came to the edge of the camp, they went into a tent, they ate and drank. Then they picked up the silver, the gold, and the clothing, and went off and hid them. So they go into this camp. Nobody is there. It is a paradise of supplies. And they go in and they ransack it. Y'all remember that show called Supermarket Sweep? I remember the game show where you had 30 seconds or whatever with your shopping cart, and you get all you could in there and then get out. And you had to get back across the finish line with your shopping cart. That's what these guys look like. Get everything you can and let's go. And they ran back and they hid it. It says then they came back and they went in another tent and they picked up some more things and they went and hid that. So they're loading up on stuff, right? They are just collecting and plundering and getting everything they can. Now notice some things. Faith had sent them to a place of provision. They just had enough faith in their desperate place to look at their options and go, that is the one. But they had to make that leap of risk, of trust, of desperation, go, I have to try that. And for a lost person, that's where that person gets to sometimes. Think about people that you've heard their testimony when they've said, I was as low as I could get. I was in as bad a place as I could be, and I found God. And that's what these people were doing. They said the same thing. They found provision. They found it all. And so it says here that in verse 9, they said to each other, wait a minute, we're not doing what's right. Somewhere in all this, collecting all this stuff, one of them's mind and heart and soul begins to say, wait a minute, this is not right. We're just collecting all this stuff. And they began to see so much blessing on themselves that they started to remember something, where they were. They were outside the city gate starving to death, and now they've been given it all. And I got to believe that they were sitting there and they started remembering, wait a minute, I've got family in the city back there that's starving. They're eating donkey head, right? I've got friends and neighbors that I love, that I care about, and they are going to starve to death. They're suffering inside that city. And I love the words that the writer uses here in the scripture. He says, today is a day of good news. And think about the times that you read in the New Testament when Jesus is born, where the angel comes to the shepherds and says, I bring to you good news. And we talk about the good news. And then all through Jesus' ministry, he says, I come to share the good news. And here we see the same thing. This is a day of good news. He says, if we're silent and we wait until the morning, our punishment will catch up with us. In other words, if we keep this stuff and we don't go tell somebody about it, we're going to be held down in conviction so much that it's going to bother us more and more and more. Man, the church ought to feel the same way. We ought to be the same way. We ought to feel, if we keep this secret to ourselves and we don't go tell somebody, show it to somebody, it ought to bother us. And instead we've been silent this whole time. I'm going to stop right here and tell a story that I heard this week. It's not my story. I just read it or heard it, and I wanted to share it because it was so good to me. There was this man, elderly man, and he was getting up in age, and I got to hurry up, but he was getting on up in age, and the people in his neighborhood, they really didn't know him very good, didn't think he had any family, nobody ever visited. And he had meager circumstances there. His home wasn't very nice or fancy. He didn't keep it up very well, and everybody just assumed he was a pretty poor guy. When he passed away, no one came to take care of his belongings, and so a couple of neighbors that did have some acquaintance with him from time to time agreed to go take care of his affairs. And when they went to his place and they walked inside, and only one or two had ever been inside anyway, they found exactly what they expected. Old furniture, old bed, old appliances that barely worked. Just the man had really not done anything. So they assumed that he was penniless. But one of them went up in the attic. And in the attic, they found 200 violins in cases. 200. And one of the violins up there was a Stradivarius. Now, I don't know a lot of facts about musical instruments and that, but I do know what a Stradivarius violin. The thing was valued at almost $1 million. And there the man sat with all that wealth up in his attic. And the one guy that was there quoted him as saying, he didn't need to talk about the money. He said, look at all the music that could have been made by the violins that are stuck in these cases. Look at the wealth and the treasure that the man had that was never enjoyed over all this time that he's been hoarding them up in his attic. What a shame. And the guy that was telling the story, he said, that is exactly like the church that has such a secret and a treasure that we can enjoy, not being willing to take the violins out of the cases and go play them. Not share the treasure, not enjoy the gift that God's been given to us in salvation. And here we see there's something very similar in these four men. They did not do that. They instead, it says they said, so let's go tell the king's household. We're not just going to go tell a couple. We're going to the king. The king has to know this. This is a big deal. So the diseased men came and called to the city's gatekeepers, because they're not allowed to go see the king, remember. They're not allowed to go in the city. They've been restricted. And the gatekeeper said, we went to the Aramean camp and no one was there, no human sounds. There was nothing tethered but horses and donkeys, and the tents were intact. And the gatekeepers called out, and the news was reported to the king's household. This is the middle of the night, remember? King's asleep. We don't wake up the king unless you got some big news. It has to be something urgent. Verse 12, so the king got up in the night and said to his servants, let me tell you what the Arameans have done to us. The king is very suspicious right from the start. Okay, that's what king's jobs are, I guess. They always second guess everything. But he says, they know we're starving, and they've left the camp to hide in the open country. There's a lot of rocks and hills and caves and everything for the soldiers to hide. He said, they've left this camp open, and I'll tell you what they're doing. This is a trap. He says, when they come out of the city, They're sitting there thinking, when the people come out, we're going to get them. We'll take them alive and go into the city. So he's concocted this scheme that he thinks the Aramean army is cooked up, that they're hiding in the caves, waiting for the people to go into their camp, get their stuff, and then they're going to attack them. And so the king immediately goes to that first thought. But verse 13, one of his servants responded, please let messengers take 5 of the horses that are left in the city. So the messenger says, wait, let's try something, because this could be something good. Don't just count it out, dear king. He says, let's send some messengers. Their fate, like the entire Israelite community who will die. So let's send them and see. He says, so we're going to sacrifice a couple of messengers and go check this out and see if it's for real. So the messengers took chariots, verse 14, with horses, and the king sent them after the Aramean army, and saying, go and see. So they followed him as far as the Jordan. So they sent these messengers all the way to the Jordan River. That's about 25 miles. We learned that last week from Naaman's travel, that he was going to have to go 25 miles to get to the Jordan River to dip himself, which in walking distance was pretty good. Okay, long distance here. So all the way to the Jordan River, and they didn't find anybody. Nobody. They saw that the whole way was instead littered with clothes and equipment. Apparently this noise that God sent of chariots and horses was pretty scary, because these guys went from military soldiers ready to attack Samaria to freaked out, scared to death guys who just dropped everything, including their clothes and their swords and everything, and they were bolting for safety. And so it says, they had thrown off in their haste, and the messengers returned and told the king. Now, our study book stops right there, but I want to continue this story because there's a part of this that that we need to learn before we stop today. So, verse 15, it says, they followed the forest of Jordan. We're going down verse 16. Then the people went out and plundered the Aramean camp. Once it was safe and they knew that there was nobody going to get them, here go the people. It's real. Those lepers weren't lying. That stuff is there, and God has given it to us. The people went out and plundered the Aramean camp, and it was then that 6 quarts of fine flour sold for half an ounce of silver, and 12 quarts of barley sold for half an ounce of silver, according to the word of the Lord. Exactly what Elisha said was going to happen happened. Verse 17, the king had appointed the captain, don't miss this, the same captain that we heard at the beginning, his right-hand man, to be in charge of the city gate. Everything's happening at the city gate. But the people trampled him in the gate. He died, just as the man of God had predicted when the king had come to him. When the man of God had said to the king, about this time tomorrow, 12 quarts of barley will sell for half an ounce of silver, and 6 quarts of fine flour will sell for half an ounce of silver at Samaria's gate. This captain had answered the man of God. Jeremiah's reminding us what he said. Look, even if the Lord were to make windows in heaven, could this really happen? Elisha had said, you will in fact see it, but you won't enjoy any of it. And this is what happened. And the people trampled him, and he died. So the last thing I want to mention is how God had provided. God provided here. Think about the times when God provided. He provided for the Israelite nation when Joseph was taken into captivity in Egypt, and he wound up making the biggest food drive in history and saved the people. And then later when the people crossed the Red Sea and God provided again the manna for them to survive. And back to what we talked about at the beginning, even though the tribes had split and the 10 tribes in the north had abandoned God, God still kept his promise and said, that is my people. Those are my people. Those 10 tribes that have left, they're still my people. And there's a remnant of those folks that's going to be with me forever. And I'm going to provide for them. And he did so here. So we see the different things that happen throughout that story. And we look at the unlikely heroes of it, those 4 lepers. And we see the story that we learn from it, that we don't need to keep the good news to ourselves. And instead we need to give something away that we've learned, that good news, because it's the provision that the lost world is looking for. The same food that the people in Samaria were starving from famine, couldn't find anything to eat, that's the food that the lost people in our world are waiting to find. And they're waiting for somebody to just say, here it is, It's provided for you. God has provided it. All you have to do is be willing to go get it. So as we wrap up that little section, next week we go a little farther into the story, but we see Elisha's miracle once again as he used the power of God to do exactly what he was told to do, and we see the miracles that God does each and every time we read his word. Anybody got comments or questions? The time is up. Boy, this is some good stuff we're studying. The story after story after story, they just get better and better, and we see Elisha and all his good work. And he's such a man of faith. He was willing to say things and do things because he already had talked to God about it. He knew what he was doing. All right, let's close with